myself and local society. So through my prayers, through my worship, through my obedience, through my spiritual practice, that's supposed to be something that translates into my care for others virtually. So as a very quick introduction, when you want to understand the relationship between Islam and activism, right? Islamic spirituality talks about the cultivation of the heart, but that's seemingly where a lot of people, they conclude it. They say it talks about perfection of the human being, reaching perfection, being someone who's merciful, who's compassionate, who's generous, dedicating myself in long hours of worship and so on. But and again, people see that as the be all end all of spirituality. But when you take a little bit of a deeper dive into the tradition, you see that it can't be limited to that, but rather that's just the first step in being someone who's at the forefront in serving, in caring for others, the poor, the orphans, the widows, the homeless, the unemployed, whatever it is, whoever those who are isolated, marginalized in community. It starts with, again, this cultivation of the heart and supposed to project outwardly.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm always struck by how much resonance there is, and I feel like Faiyaz and I could just, if this were a different context, we'd be like at a Starbucks or something, and we could just kind of get into some really neat comparative things. But a lot of Faiyaz, what you just shared is, I know, very particular to Islamic theology, but also I think resonates with Hinduism in general, and the particular tradition within Hinduism that speaks most to me, which is a very devotional, relational tradition within Hinduism. Hindu tradition is a very broad category, as is Islam, of course. But so I would be remiss to kind of to hold myself as speaking on behalf of all of Hinduism or all Hindus. But I do want to point out a couple of just real kind of common foundational principles that get us to this idea of sacred activism, or activism that connects with our faith. So as Faiyaz gives such a beautiful and succinct kind of snapshot of really how his faith conceptualizes who we are at heart and what is our eternal or you can say eternal relationship with God, with our divine source. In Hindu traditions, there's an analogy that is used in one of the oldest texts that is known to Hinduism, but even just one of the oldest religious texts that we know of on planet Earth. And this particular text, it's known as the Rigveda. And in this text, you have this beautiful analogy that's given that essentially analogizes every living being is to the divine what tiny sparks are to a great fire. So in the sense of quantity, there's no comparison. The spark is tiny. The fire in the example is infinitely more vast and greater than the spark. The spark is infinitesimal. The fire is infinite. But there is a oneness in quality. That the spark derives from the fire. Therefore, the nature of the spark is the nature of fire. So sometimes you'll hear this in terms of Hindu theology or Hindu thought, the idea of the divine within me and the divine within you, and that's a part of the tradition as well. But the idea again is that we are sparks from our divine beloved, who is the source. And I bring that up because that, in some way, if we're trying to understand activism through the lens of Hindu faith tradition, that always has to be the foundation. This kind of relationship that we have where we are simultaneously one in terms of our truest potential is a part of that divinity. And we're also distinct in that divinity is the infinite transcendence, and we are, and I love the idea of servanthood. This is very resonant with our tradition as well, where we are eternally servants. So with that framework, then the question that's raised is what should be our purpose in life? It's a very vast subject, but if we are sparks of this spiritual divinity, we find ourselves separated from him, and we find ourselves in a world of matter, a world where we're embodied, and with our bodies come the senses, come the pull of the senses, the temptations of the senses, come cravings, come afflictive emotions like anger, envy, greed, lust. Those are qualities that are, according to our tradition, symptoms of our present condition, that we're embodied and that we're alienated from our divine source. But that's a reality that we find ourselves in. So we need to figure out a way of how to act responsibly in this world so that we can draw nearer to our divine source, rather than further and further estranged from him. I hope that makes sense. Most of you have your cameras off, so I can't tell. If I have a request, if you can put your camera on, I don't want to embarrass anyone or put anyone on the spot, but if you can put your camera on, I would find it very, very helpful. It would be very encouraging to me because I'm a little nervous here. So I want to make sure that, so I hope that like little kind of foundational piece resonates and makes sense, at least theoretically. When we start there and then we ask ourselves, what is our responsibility in this world? One word that gets used for responsibility is this Sanskrit word dharma, which becomes very, very important in Hindu and Buddhist traditions. And there's a beautiful text called the Bhagavad Purana. And in that text is an instruction or you can say a teaching that explains that ultimately the supreme dharma, we all have our responsibilities and roles in life, and those are important as well. But the supreme responsibility, the ultimate responsibility is Savaipong sang paro dharmo yatho bhaktir adoksaje haituki apratihata yayatma suprasiddhati. That the dharma of every person is unconditional, unmotivated love directed towards our divine source, towards the supreme. When we experience that love for him, it's called bhakti or devotion. But what's interesting is those same texts tell us when we take that love and we direct it towards his creation, towards all beings, towards the natural world, towards the world around us, that same love, it's the same love, it's the same emotion, but it manifests as compassion and justice. And so when we conceptualize it that way in the Hindu faith tradition, we can look at activism as not something separate from a spiritual pursuit, but actually it's not the only one, but one important manifestation of how we experience and how we live out our love, right? It's very easy to say, I love you. I've been married now for almost 20 years. And it's very easy for me to say to my wife, I love you. But if I keep saying that, but I'm not actually practically doing anything, I'm not helping her, I'm not partnering with her, I'm not playing an active role in parenting our daughter, I'm not, helping out in the kitchen or doing dishes or whatever, kind of example you can think of. If I'm not doing that, then not that my words don't mean anything, but that how hollow, how empty are they? Right? I've missed so many opportunities. It's not a matter of force, but I've missed so many opportunities to express that love, to show that love, to demonstrate that love and live it out. And so in the same way, we can profess our love, and we should profess our love to the divine and our eternal servitude. And we can make prayers and perform religious ritual, and that's wonderful. And at the same time, Can we act out that love in our actions? Can we live out that love in terms of taking responsibility, and especially to care for the most vulnerable, the most seemingly insignificant? That, at least as far as the sort of bhakti or devotional theology of Hinduism, that pleases God so much. That pleases God, just as if you may or may not do something nice for me, it may not make such a difference. But the second you show some kindness towards my daughter, particularly if my daughter is in a very vulnerable position, if she's, if she's hurt in some way or she's in need of something, and then you come and you help her and you sacrifice for her and you serve her, how much that will please me. So in the same way, how much we can please God and how much we can connect and draw nearer to him by caring for his beloved children in this world, and everything that we do, remembering him as we do it.
I'm gonna, Melanie, before you ask your next question, if you don't mind, is that okay?
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, I mean, that was really, really powerful and really beautiful, and I just wanted to mention that seemingly there is a lot of overlap and similarity in this regard. One of the ways by which, or the way by which we understand God within Islamic tradition is by understanding what are known as God's names, or Asma'ullah. We say symbolically that God has 99 names. He doesn't really have 99 names. He has many more names and attributes. So God is the all-merciful. He's the all-omnipotent. He's the all-seeing. He's the all-generous. He's the all-hearing. He's the all-just. He's the all-beautiful. He's the ever-grateful. So on and so forth, right? All of the sublime, most perfect metaphysical qualities. God is the owner of all of those, all of them in their most perfect, form, the all-knowledgeable, etc. And, seemingly the conversation that we're engaging in, this evening is in regards to God being the all-just. One of God's names is Al-Adil, the all-just, the ever-just, meaning that he is consistently in a place to dispense his justice by means of, if I do a good deed, he's going to reward me. If I do a bad deed, he will punish me, for instance. But at the same time, he is the all-merciful. So if I commit a bad deed, but if I repent, he'll also forgive me at the same time. And the way, for instance, that God created the creation is by means of his, out of his justice. He placed things where they belong, so to say. And kind of like within the spiritual tradition, there's this really strong emphasis on striving our best to illuminating or reflecting God's name. So something very, very similar to, I thought, what you mentioned. There's a prophetic hadith, prophetic statement, which he states, "Takhallaqu bi akhlaqillah." Act in accordance with the etiquette of God. So God is the all-merciful, then I have to strive to emanating mercy, though my mercy doesn't compare to God's mercy, right? It doesn't mean anything. My mercy to my children, or to my spouse, or to my friends, or so on and so forth, doesn't compare. But nonetheless, at the very least, in the name, in the semantics of it, I am striving my best to emanate mercy. And when we talk about this idea of, sacred spiritual activism, it goes back to this idea of putting on our best effort toward employing or reflecting or manifesting this notion of, God's justice on earth, right? Not in a way that is, authoritative or demeaning, whereby I'm going to say that, look, I'm here to establish God's law, right? No, but in a way that I strive my best to putting things, where they belong. Something as simple as, being equitable to my students when they, when they write their final papers. I can't say, oh, I don't like Melanie, so I'm not going to give her a very good grade, right? That would be unjust, inequitable of me. Or things, like that of, racism and discrimination and so on and so forth. There is no room for that within our religious tradition. So making sure that we're emanating or reflecting God's justice in this regard is sort of the core of the issue. So I just thought I'd share that because I felt that it had a lot of overlap to some of the things that you said in some way.
Thank you both for your beautiful reflections. And this is just a reminder that we are also live streaming on the Islamic Center's Facebook page. And before we move on to the next question, I just want to say how amazing it is that like we can see like the different overlapping similarities between all of our different beliefs. And I think it's important, especially during these times, like to reflect on the idea that we're all eternally servants, as Chaplain Vineet has said. And yeah, we should also be thinking about like, who are we? Like, why am I here? What is our responsibility in this world? And I know like I always hear Sheikh Faiyaz say that. So it's nice to hear that again from different perspectives. And we can move on to our next question, which is, how have you been able to implement faith-based activism in your work that you do as a chaplain at your different universities in your day-to-day life? And what kind of like community goals that you have?
Vineet, I answered the first one first. Your turn now.
So I can answer honestly, or I can answer formally.
Please answer honestly.
So my honest answer is not enough. This is a major growing edge for me. I'm also probably the oldest person on this call. So some of it is age and stage, and I'm, it's something that when I was, if I'm being very honest, when I was in some of my formative years in terms of my own spiritual practice, and then eventually, kind of holding this space as a chaplain and a caregiver, this wasn't really emphasized, and it's quite sad in some respects. But although it's there in our traditions, as we just so beautifully heard and reflected on, there was this tendency to sort of put it on the back burner, and especially I think within the last, I don't know, maybe half a decade or so, it's really, I've been humbled to find that it's no longer acceptable to keep it on the back burner. And so I'm trying to grow and learn in those ways. So I honestly say it's not false. I mean, maybe a little bit of false modesty and humility, but it's a lot just really honestly saying this has been a growing edge for me. Where I've felt really inspired has been in the realm of efforts around equity, diversity and inclusion at the university on a number of levels, but particularly in terms of people of color and the kind of embodied experience of trauma and kind of inherited inferiority, and where that does or doesn't intersect with faith and spirituality, right? It's very complicated. And I don't want to take us on a tangent, but both of our traditions speak so powerfully and beautifully about the idea of conceptualizing ourselves, not just conceptualize, but actually being servants or slaves. And so that's a beautiful idea on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have real history of oppression and of marginalization, and where people have been made to feel less than and have been metaphorically or literally enslaved in a way that's very different than the idea of being, the best of the slaves of God or the servants of God. So how to hold that tension and be real about it, that's something that I've been exploring a lot and trying to work with students around. And then the other piece, which is another topic for another day, perhaps. But what I've been personally really energized by is the idea of sacred ecology and response to issues of climate crisis and sustainability, not despite religious affiliation, but through the lens of faith, right? For so long, particularly in the West, there's been such a separation between kind of the religious folks and then the folks on the front lines of like climate justice. And I think those, we're starting to see now a very different approach where it's possible to actually dig into our faith traditions and to draw from those faith traditions to address, the violence and exploitation that our common mother Earth has been subjected to, and to draw from these faith resources to offer a kind of a theological or theologically robust kind of form of activism, where we're acting, but we're also acting from a place that's informed by faith. That's not just sort of go, go, go. I am the savior. But as Faiyaz was so beautifully saying, how can I be even a tiny reflection of God's grace, of God's mercy, of God's justice.
Yeah, thank you, Vineet, for that. I think also to keep in mind, going back to something, that going back to the focal point of the conversation where we started with, sort of theologically. Sorry, just give me 1 second.
Faiyaz's daughters, by the way, have become like the superstar guest stars for our Zoom classes. So
sorry,
I'm hoping that they might make an appearance on this call as well.
I'm trying to keep them away. That's why I told you to give me a minute. So to take one step back before answering the question, Melanie, and my answer is probably very similar to Vineet's in that there's so much more work to be done. And unfortunately, we've not been able to, personally, I've not been able to push forth and really be a difference maker in the way that I ask God to help me and to make me be that virtually. When we talk about, going back to this theme that we talked about earlier around theological justice, that God is the all just, the human being it can understand God's justice and our relationship with this, term of the all justice of God, or the divine justice of God, in sort of two frames. The first frame is in knowing that we ourselves have been unjust to ourselves as human beings. Every time we transgress God's boundaries, every time we see ourselves as better than someone else, every time we emanate any ounce of pride, arrogance, discrimination, we speak poorly about someone, anything that we do and everything that we do that is void of God's remembrance itself is performing an act of injustice to our own hearts, to our own souls. So when I'm striving to be, an activist, I need to first work toward reconciling my heart and my soul over here. You know what I'm saying? So you start internally. So how can I really be someone who's a difference maker outwardly around efforts, within the frame of diversity and inclusion, right? Within the frame of calling out the bigotries and the racisms and the injustices that we're seeing socially, that we're seeing economically, that we're seeing politically, if we still have not reconciled those spiritual diseases that we have internally, right? That does not mean that we don't focus on the external if we haven't necessarily reconciled that which is internal yet. You know what I'm saying? It's supposed to be a path that we're growing with, that we're cultivating, side by side along with one another. I just wanted to throw that out there. So, building off of that, in the potential of the work that we do, externally, societally, communally, toward really combating the injustices that we're seeing every day, the first step, I think, is to be in a state of self-reflection, of understanding or really reflecting upon where my acts of injustice on the daily are. Am I fair to my children? Am I equitable to my children at home? There's so many situations and circumstances that you see people on the front lines striving to make a difference in the name of, social justice movements or so on, but then they go back home and they're, abusive to their spouses and to their children, right? Physically, emotionally, whatever it might be. So I think that it's super important that we understand that the grounding has to start, internally before any sort of external effort. And I think that when someone sees, and I don't mean this sort of as a cop-out to not answer the question, but when we see ourselves, being deficient internally, spiritually, then naturally we're also going to see deficiency externally in the efforts that we're trying to engage in. And I think that's a good thing because that demonstrates that we always seem there's room for growth sort of in our lives and our work and so on. That said, to really echo, what Vineet said, is that there's a lot of stuff to do. There's so many efforts that we need to engage in. Right now, maybe I'll just throw this out as kind of, as a quick plug. Our center is currently, the Islamic Center at New York University, is currently raising funds for individuals and families impacted by COVID-19 in New York City and across the region. In the last 10 or 12 days, we've been able to raise $400,000, right? And then we can still go back and sort of pat ourselves in the back and be like, well, we raised $400,000. Last year, we raised $900,000 during the month of Ramadan to build a domestic violence shelter. And we could go and say like, oh my God, like this is amazing. but we cannot stop and say that $400,000 is enough when we see the inequities and the systemic racism and sort of economic, deficiencies that we have within our political system. $900,000 is not enough for a domestic violence shelter when you see the number of cases that we are seeing on a day-to-day basis. What is the next step that we need to make on this journey? The food pantry, whatever it might be, right? We need to never be complacent in our effort toward striving toward being at the support of members within our local communities. So we have a lot more room to grow. We have done things, and they are nice, good deeds, and we feel comfortable and happy that we've been able to accomplish. But once we get complacent in telling ourselves that we've done X and Y and Z, we're not going to be able to grow and again really illuminate that idea of internal spiritual justice that can then be manifested externally toward the establishment of societal justice.
Thank you both for those very thoughtful responses. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more quick question. We have to wrap up by 7:40 to accommodate another program by the Islamic Center. And our next question is, how can we as leaders and members of our religious communities know what forms of activism to encourage in our own faith? And if anyone does have any further questions, feel free to reach out to both of our chaplains. Thank you.
So I can give it a shot, and I'll try to be mindful of time as well. I think it's a great question. I would like to approach it a little bit less from the point of view of specific types of activism, although that's an interesting conversation too, when you look at sort of more nonviolent versus maybe a little bit more kind of adversarial or combative forms of protest. But rather than look at those categories, I think, at least speaking as a Hindu, there are certain kind of traps that we need to be wary of and to help others be wary of. And I think Faiyaz started this, conversation off by, again, reminding us to sort of introspect about, kind of where are we coming from? What's our mindset with this? Are we doing the inner work, or are we just doing all the outer work? And so there's a couple of just like quick kind of like sort of pitfalls that I think need to be acknowledged. The first is the idea of ego and egotism, that very quickly being an activist can become an ego trip. And in Sanskrit, the word for ego, or one of the words for ego, is this really interesting word. It's ahankar. And one of the meanings of this word, ahankar, is a compound word. It means I am the doer. So it's a really interesting kind of notion, because it's like, whether subtly or grossly, when we're operating the level of ego, it's like, I'm doing it. I'm the one who's making it happen, right? Look, we raise this much money. I raise this much money. Like, from a kind of a more spiritual perspective, can we shift that to, this is an opportunity to be an instrument, but something and someone far greater than me is flowing through me, and can flow just as easily through Faiyaz, or just as easily as through Sangeeta or through Melanie, right? So it's not about me. Can I decenter myself so that that flow of grace, that flow of mercy, that flow of justice can flow however it needs to flow to where it needs to flow, and I can be an instrument as part of that. I can take that opportunity, because anyways, it's going to flow. So might as well, for my own purification, also take that opportunity to be a part of it, right? To play a tiny role in it. So that egotism. And then a kind of a similar idea is the idea of attachment, that we can set out to do great good, and we can even have the best of intentions. But when we become attached to a particular result, we have a particular expectation that's, again, tied to that sense of ego. That's when things become very fraught. And then the third piece that I just want to leave us with is something that's not exactly a popular view in most circles, but it's something that as people of faith, I think we really need to own. And that is that as much as we try to positively impact the world, our calling is for something much greater. So wellness is amazing. Justice equity. We can strive for that as far as possible, but at least from a Hindu theological point of view, this world that we're living in is not our true home. And so we want to serve in the way that we can, but we don't want to lose sight of the fact that ultimately what we're aiming towards is a transcendence, is a real homecoming to our actual source, to our eternal source and our eternal divine beloved. We don't want to lose sight of that in the very important work of making this world a better place. But ultimately, there is also that kind of prophetic message of the ultimate transcendence is something beyond even the most wonderful situation in this world. It's still not paradise here, and it's not meant to be.
That was beautiful. I don't know if we have time, but I mean, that was really powerful. Should we just let that be? Like, why don't we just sit on that? That's amazing.
No, I'm so sorry, Faiyaz. Please.
No. That was amazing. I was going to say the first one in particular, the first two actually that you mentioned. Number one, like the ego that we often allow to come to the forefront of any like real meaningful work and initiatives. And when you were talking, it reminded me of a prophetic statement in which he was in a gathering of his companions, Prophet Muhammad, and he tells them that if God wants good for his servant, if God wants good for a believer, he will make him useful. So everyone, from the gathering, they said, "Oh, Prophet of God," and "Oh, Muhammad, like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be useful?" He said, "If God wants good for you, he will make you the vessel by which you make a difference in your community." So to do that meaningful work again, and to know that it came from him, right? And that if we get caught up and we get exhausted in the midst of doing it and complaining, "Why am I doing this?" it could get taken away. And when it gets taken away, no longer are we being useful anymore. We're just eating and we're drinking and we're sleeping, and that's it. What's the point then? What's the point of all of this? And then number two, again, to also not to get caught up and to think that this is from me, right? A lot of times, in folks in activist spaces and so on, not to be critical, there's something that you have to often see is that, you get so caught up in working for one initiative in one project that you forget the end goal, right? You get so caught up in the politics of that organization or that institution or that effort that you forget that at the end of the day, like, what was the purpose of all of this? It was to, again, if we're centered spiritually, this won't happen. We'll consistently be striving toward an ideal, even if we don't necessarily get there. So if my intention is to cure homelessness in New York City, for instance, I can only work toward that ideal, and I should always work toward that ideal. Realistically, am I ever going to get there and manifest that reality? Very unlikely, right? But at the end of the day, I have to be working for that. And then I have to realize that my work is for God's sake, and I'm striving toward, in the process, perform this purification. But I thought you said a lot more beautifully and eloquent than I, so that's why I didn't want to share anything.
Thank you again to everyone who participated this evening in our conversation, and a special thanks to Chaplain Vineet and Sheikh Faiyaz for taking the time out of their busy schedules.
Pleasure.
Thank you for blessing us with your knowledge.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Vineet. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
If anyone has any further questions, unfortunately, we didn't have time for any questions, but their emails are right in the chat below.
Take care, guys. Thank you so much.